In this video, I will show you how the seller payment to buyer's broker form works. It's CAR form SPBB. It's going to be used more often. You'll see this more often now, since the settlement is going to require agents to use a buyer representation agreement. And we have a real world case scenario that happened yesterday. So I modeled this form off of what happened yesterday that caused some confusion. So I thought it would be a good time to show how this form works, given that listing agents will see it more often, buyer's agents will need to use it more often, and I'll show you how it corresponds to this buyer representation agreement. So this form, just simply one page. I'll skip past this. These are just instructions. You can read that if you want, but I'm going to show you how this form works because it's very simple. There are basically these preambles here. It's like in a contract when you see whereas, it's background information, it's context. So it's stating here in line 1 that there's a buyer representation agreement. It's acknowledging the existence of a buyer representation agreement. So the buyer's agent, in the scenario we had yesterday, the buyer's agent sent this with their offer, and the listing agent had some questions about it. Well, the buyer's agent is stating when they fill this out that they have a buyer representation agreement and that the buyer has pledged to pay their broker 2.5%. And that's what it looks like here on a buyer representation agreement. 4A, this is where the buyer is pledging or creating an obligation to pay their broker, their representative, and this is the percent. Okay, so it's stating, hey, this exists. Then number 2, it's acknowledging something else. It's like another whereas for background contextual information. So it's saying that the listing broker is offering a 2% commission. So that's typically what you see in the MLS. You go in the MLS, you look at a listing, and you see how much the listing broker is offering the buyer's agent. And so in this case, the listing broker is offering 2%. Okay, now this is the most important part. It's asking for the seller to pay. And I should say specifically, the buyer's agent is asking the seller pay. That's why this form is called seller payment to buyer's broker. Just to be clear, a listing broker, as it stands now, the listing broker is paying the commission to the buyer's agent. And I know people say, well, the seller's paying, okay, the seller's paying the listing broker. The seller's not paying the buyer's broker directly. That's part of the reason why this whole lawsuit and everything that's going on now is stemmed from nonsense, but that's a separate topic. The bottom line is, right now in this form on line 3, you will see a request made that the buyer's agent's asking the seller to pay the buyer's broker directly, not through the listing broker, but directly, 0.5%. Why is that? Well, because the buyer's on the hook for 2.5%. And buyer's agents have historically done this, by the way. It may change given that everything's changing after the settlement agreement, the NAR settlement, but typically buyer's agents will tell their buyer, don't worry, I'm going to put this amount on here, but you won't be on the hook for it. And then the buyer's agent, and I do not advocate this, okay? I'm just saying that this is the state of things, because ask yourselves, how often does the buyer actually pay commission out of pocket? Rarely ever. It's extremely rare. Why is that? Because the buyer representation agreement, it says right here, if anyone other than the buyer compensates the broker for services, that amount shall be credited toward the buyer's obligation. So if the seller or the listing agent, if anyone is chipping in money to that buyer's agent for their commission, then it's credited toward this. It reduces this amount. And so therein lies the problem. The buyer's on the hook for 2.5. The listing agent's only offering 2. The buyer's still on the hook for 0.5%. But buyer's agents have in the past said that don't worry, we'll let you off the hook. You won't have to pay anything. I'll get it from somewhere. So in this case, this agent is asking the seller to pay the difference because you add the 0.5% with the 2%, and then it's equal to what the buyer's on the hook for in the buyer representation agreement, and it cancels it out because, again, this is all credited, as it says down here on this paragraph D, that it credits toward the buyer's obligation. Okay, so keep in mind, this does not change anything. Like this can be confused with the CBC form, cooperating broker compensation form. It's not. That form, the CBC form, changes commission. We're not changing what the listing agent's offering on the MLS. We're not changing anything up here. These are just preambles for background information, so it all makes sense. And then we see down here that this buyer's agent is asking the seller to pay the difference. So it's important that we understand that this is being incorporated in more offers and will be, especially once we hit that date when all the settlement changes the policies are instituted for NAR members. And now I think that this is actually going to be, this form will eventually be used less as people get more comfortable with the concept, and this is going to go into the offer itself. There will probably even be a section in future revisions of the purchase agreement that incorporates something like this, where a seller credit is just streamlined, or the sellers agreed to give a credit from the outset. I think that's going to happen in the future. But if you have any questions, please leave a comment. Thank you for watching.